order, please. I would like to make a speaker's ruling today before we start today's proceedings. Yesterday, the Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition rose on a point of privilege arising from what he described as the government's move to curtail debate at the Law Amendments Committee. This was based on the same situation that had been raised earlier yesterday as a point of order. In my ruling yesterday on the point of order, I pointed out that I was being asked to rule on something that might not happen. That is, that if it might turn out that the presentations to the committee were not cut off yesterday, as the honourable member feared, and that the presenters would be allowed to appear today. As it turns out, that is exactly what has taken place. Accordingly, the fact situation underpinning the point of privilege did not come to pass, and the facts therefore do not support a finding of a prima facie breach of privilege. While I understand the member's concern about the way things appear to be occurring, I feel that I should caution all members about the timing of points of orders and points of privilege. In the cases of points raised yesterday, both were related to a meeting of a committee that had not yet happened at the time they were raised. As I said yesterday, the Speaker should not be asked to rule on situations that have not yet occurred. As it turned out, the anticipated situation did not unfold as predicted, and presenters on the bill in question will be heard today. This was the point I made in my ruling on the point of order, and I ask that the members exercise caution before raising points of orders or points of privileges before they have been either actually breach of the rules or actual breach of a privilege. Thank you. The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your ruling on that matter. And actually, what happened there was that the move to change the rules was done without the committee approving it, and the move to change back the rules was also done without the committee approving it. So I would have had to do one of two things: either do what I did yesterday, or wait till today and do it. So anyway, your ruling is okay, and I appreciate the large amount of time you must have taken to come to that conclusion. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And quite simply, we do accept your ruling on this one, but I think for future, we would like to be able to see a reasonable amount of time, a reasonable amount of notice when it comes to some changes to committees as they go along. So, if in your chair that you could make sure that committee chairs are aware of making sure that, decent notice is given to all members, including the people that will be presenting at them, I think everything will be fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Point well taken. I will now start orders of the day, the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Before I go any further with that ruling, I got thrown off my schedule. I must also have the topic for late debate read, and it has been chosen, and I will now read the topic. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier stop misleading Nova Scotians when he says that all NDP campaign promises were met, and take responsibility for his government's inaction on matters of public concern since June 2009, and it was submitted by the Honourable Member for Dartmouth East. Very good. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas an estimated 65,000 Canadians are living with HIV, and thousands of new HIV infections occur every year, having a significant impact on the lives of those who are infected, their families, and our communities. And whereas marginalization and the stigma attached to HIV continue to create serious barriers for HIV/AIDS prevention, care, treatment, and support, and whereas reducing HIV infections and helping Nova Scotians living with HIV and AIDS have the best possible quality of life remains a priority, of the government and its many community partners through Nova Scotia's strategy on HIV/AIDS. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize November 24th to 30th as HIV/AIDS Awareness Week and December the 1st, 2011 as World AIDS Day in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin my resolution, may I please make an introduction?
Most certainly.
Thank you. Joining us in the gallery today are the people who help for opportunities for Nova Scotian youth to be involved in their communities through the Duke of Edinburgh Awards program. We have in our gallery, and if you don't mind standing when I say your name, I would appreciate that. That is Connie Miller, the Executive Director, Carol Thompson, President, Karen Lusso, the Award Officer, Don Todd, Member of the Board of Regents and past President, Rick Powell, is the honorary counsel. I don't think is here, but hopefully he'll show up later. And I think I have all of the people that are here representing the Duke of Edinburgh Award program, and I do ask the host to give them a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh's award program is helping students from across the province to get involved in their communities and develop self-reliance, discipline, and social responsibility, and whereas more than 2,300 young Nova Scotians from between the ages of 14 to 25 participate in Duke programs each year to promote community and county development, while teaching the life skills that lead to personal growth and achievement. And whereas the Duke of Edinburgh's awards program has had a profound and positive influence on the lives of thousands of our young Nova Scotians. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly thank the hundreds of adult volunteers who give freely of their time and talents to encourage young people in a spirit of adventure, fitness of mind and body, initiatives, creativity, and service to others. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I see that we've been joined in the gallery again by the people involved in my resolution. And may I make an introduction?
Most certainly.
Thank you. Joining us in the gallery today are students from 10 countries who are visiting and studying in our province as part of the Nova Scotia International Student Program. This year, about 90 schools across the province are hosting international students, and I'm pleased that they have the opportunity to learn alongside our youth. And I'd like to, if you wouldn't mind standing when I say your name, and before I call your names out, I apologize if I don't have the correct pronunciation, but I will try my best. I know how important it is to have a name said properly, but I will do my best. We have Soshi Miyazakai, and he's from Japan. We have Zaina and Porchna Chawa from Thailand. And we have Eduardo Bria from Italy, Anna Remskuza from Poland. I really need lessons in this. Yuki Sivi from Turkey, and Irene Benzati Vela from Mexico, Josef Velsky from the Czech Republic, Alice Gripa from Belgium. We have Carmen Blanco from Spain, and we have Zishu Her from Korea. And I would like to also welcome here today Dan Walsh, Program Manager, International Services, Halifax Regional School Board, and HRSB Homestay Coordinators, Jane Delory, Melissa Alexander, and Kelly Chisholm. And along with myself, I'm asking everyone to join us in giving our guest here a very warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoyed today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia International Students Program welcomed 717 students from 28 countries in September 2011, making it one of the largest international student programs in Canada. And whereas for 14 years the International Student Program has provided more than 6,000 students the opportunity to learn and grow in Nova Scotia. Whereas the Nova Scotia International Student Program makes a positive impact on Nova Scotian students by welcoming international students to join them in their classrooms. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly welcome the students from around the world and wish them all the best for their learning and for their Nova Scotia experience. Mr. Speaker, I ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do this on behalf of the Minister of Justice. I'd like to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 103 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Corrections Act.
The Honourable Minister of Justice begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 103 of the Revised Statute 1989, the Corrections Act.
Bill number 123, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 103 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Corrections Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
May I be permitted to do an introduction, Mr. Speaker?
Most certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the East Gallery, joining us today are several people who make an important contribution to the arts and culture sector here in Nova Scotia. So I'd like to introduce them and have them stand. Mr. Speaker, we have Paul Caskey, who is the Artistic Director of Live Art Dance Production and has a long history of involvement with Canada's professional dance community. We also have Leah Hamilton, who is an arts consultant with Genesis Consulting, who has worked, whose work included planning and organizational development in the arts and culture, heritage, and tourism field. And also we have Christopher Shore, who is the Executive Director of Theatre Nova Scotia and has a career that has spanned radio, stage, film, and television as an actor, playwright, and arts administrator. They have been part of a transition team who have been working with the member from Lunenburg on Arts Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Also in the gallery today, we have Ron Bougeron, who is Bougeron. Sorry, Ron, I've said your name a million times over the last while, who is the current chair of the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council, who has more than 30 years work to develop arts and culture. And also with him is Jim Morrow and Susan Took, who are also with the Creative Leadership Council. We also have staff, Marcel McCoe, who's Acting Director of Culture Division, Michael Noonan, and Peter Kirby. So I'd like the members to give them a warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoyed today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a bill, or a bill entitled An Act to Establish Arts Nova Scotia Arts Nouvelle-Écosse.
What is it? The Honourable Minister for Communities, Culture and Heritage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Establish Arts Nova Scotia Arts Nouvelle-Écosse.
Bill number 124, entitled An Act to Establish Arts Nova Scotia Arts Nouvelle-Écosse.
Order that bill be read a second time on a future day. of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Establish the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council, Conseil de leadership pour la création en Nouvelle-Écosse.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Establish the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council, Conseil de leadership pour
la création
de la
Nouvelle-Écosse.
Bill number 125, an act to establish the Creative Nova Scotia Leadership Council, Conseil de leadership pour la création en Nouvelle-Écosse.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday I had the privilege to celebrate with Nova Scotians who were presented with the highest honour bestowed by this province, the Order of Nova Scotia. And whereas the award, which was established in 2001, is intended to honor individuals who have demonstrated a high level of excellence and achievement, having brought honour and prestige to themselves and to our province. And whereas this dedication the dedication and many outstanding accomplishments of this year's honorees make them truly deserving recipients, therefore be it resolved the members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Honourable Wayne Adams, Sir Graham Day, Bruce McKinnon, Joseph Benjamin Marshall, and Budge Wilson on receipt of this prestigious award and thank them for making an incredible difference in our province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup. I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday's Order of Nova Scotia ceremony gave much deserved recognition to 5 exceptional Nova Scotians as the highest honour in our province, and whereas Mi'kmaq rights activist Joseph Benjamin Marshall, business titan Sir Graham Day, author Budge Wilson, political cartoonist Bruce McKinnon, and our first African Nova Scotian MLA Wayne Adams were honoured for their outstanding contribution to the people of this province. Whereas the Order of Nova Scotia was established 10 years ago to commemorate those who have brought honour and prestige to our province, and this year's recipients couldn't be more deserving of the award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate those 5 Nova Scotians on their induction to the Order and thank them for their remarkable contribution to this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas during the 2009 provincial election, this NDP government made a promise to make life more affordable for all Nova Scotians and to roll back the previous government's 8% tax on home electricity. And whereas on October the 1st, 2009, this NDP government followed through on that promise and removed the provincial portion of the HST from basic home electricity bills for all Nova Scotians. And whereas this government has been and will continue to be committed to making the necessities of life more affordable for all Nova Scotian families. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly thereby acknowledges that this NDP government has repeatedly kept our promises to all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas December 1st is World AIDS Day, a day which provides an opportunity for Nova Scotians and Canadians to unite in the fight against HIV, show support for those living with HIV, and remember those who have succumbed to the disease. And whereas this year's theme, Getting to Zero, focuses on eliminating new HIV infection and AIDS-related deaths, as well as discrimination against people with the disease. And whereas 5 people under the age of 30 reported they have HIV positive in Nova Scotia Public Health in 2010, signaling a trend change in infection rates among the younger demographic, which will require vigilance and attention at the provincial level. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House acknowledge today, December 1st, is World AIDS Day, and be ever mindful of the importance of prevention, education, and creation of a more supportive environment for those infected with HIV or AIDS. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, where today is World AIDS Day, an opportunity for people worldwide to unite in the fight against HIV, show support for those living with HIV, and to honor and remember those who have passed away. And whereas there are roughly 73,000 Canadians who are HIV positive or have been diagnosed with AIDS, and 35 million people across the world living with this disease. And whereas today we acknowledge the strides made to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS, but most importantly, we should let today serve as a reminder that there is still progress to be made. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the significance of this day and pledge to raise awareness about HIV/AIDS in honor of those affected in Nova Scotia and around the world. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the NDP committed during the 2009 provincial election to ensuring that more young people stay and build a life here in Nova Scotia, and to creating 250 new community college seats to provide young people with more opportunities here at home. And whereas our NDP government announced the creation of 250 new community college seats across the province, targeted to high-demand trades, professions, as part of the 2010-11 budget. And whereas demand for skilled trades professionals is growing, especially in the wake of the announcement on the National Shipbuilding Strategy on October 19, 2011, and the increased capacity of the community college to train our young people is a crucial part of preparing Nova Scotia's youth for good jobs in Nova Scotia. Therefore, it being resolved that all members of this House acknowledge this NDP government's commitment to keeping its promises in Nova Scotia and making life better for our young people. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable Member for Clare.
Monsieur le Président, par la présente, j'avise que je proposerai à une date ultérieure l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que le certificat léger comme eau est remis à une personne qui a contribué de façon spéciale au développement d'une communauté acadienne néo-écossaise, et attendu que M. Paul-Émile Leblanc est engagé dans la communauté de Clare comme bénévole depuis plusieurs années, et attendu que M. Leblanc a reçu le certificat léger comme eau pour l'année 2011, qu'il soit résolu que tous les membres de cette Assemblée législative offrent toutes leurs félicitations à M. Paul-Émile Leblanc et l'encouragent à continuer le beau travail dans la région de la Baie-Sainte-Marie. Et Monsieur le Président, je propose l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Léger Como certificate is given to special people who have contributed to the development of Acadian communities in Nova Scotia. And whereas Mr. Paul-Émile Leblanc is actively involved as a volunteer in the Clare community. And whereas Mr. Leblanc has recently received the Léger Como certificate for 2011, therefore be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Mr. Paul-Émile Leblanc and encourage him to continue his good work within the community. And Mr. Speaker, I would request for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if I might begin with an introduction before I proceed. Thank you, sir. I would like to draw the attention of all members, Mr. Speaker, to the West Gallery, where visiting us today is an Order of Nova Scotia recipient, Ms. Eva Landry and her husband, Doug. Can I like you to invite all members to give them a warm welcome to today's proceedings.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoyed today's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Avard Bentley is a Cumberland County maple producer who is well known in his community for the high standard of his products, and whereas Mr. Bentley received an award from the International Maple Syrup Institute for his ongoing contribution to the industry, and whereas Avard and his wife Jean received the honor during the North American Maple Syrup Council annual meeting in Frankenmuth, Maine. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Avard and Jean Bentley on receiving this outstanding award and wish them continued success in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Roots of Empathy program in Chignecto Central Regional School Board has increased to 5 schools in Colchester County, Harmony Heights Elementary, Valley Elementary, Tadmagush Elementary, Bible Hill East Court, and Bible Hill Central. And whereas this program teaches empathy by having a baby and a parent visit students in their classrooms. And whereas the Colchester East Hants District Health Authority provided funding for 2 women to become instructors this year. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly commend the schools, teachers, students, parents, and babies for their participation in this worthwhile program that instills such qualities in students as respect, sharing, understanding, and caring. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Beulah McLeod, formerly from Lewisburg, celebrated her 102nd birthday on November the 23rd, and whereas Beulah McLeod raised her family and dedicated her life to her family and town for all these years, and whereas Beulah currently resides at the Cove Guest Home in Sydney and looks forward to her many visits from her family and friends. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Beulah McLeod and her family on this wonderful milestone in her life and wish her many more years of health and happiness. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Brenda Zima of Bedford has been a police officer for more than 22 years, beginning her career in 1988 with the Toronto Police Department before joining the Halifax Police Department in 1991, and whereas Brenda Zima was the first woman to be named Watch Commander for the Halifax Police Department and is now the superintendent responsible for operational policing in East Division. And whereas Superintendent Zima is a recognized incident commander and has been awarded the Chief's Commendation and the Chief's Meritorious Service Award, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Superintendent Brenda Zima on her career progress and on her latest award, being named a Woman of Excellence by the Canadian Progress Club, Halifax, Cornwallis, and thank her for being a role model for the young women and men of today. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Minister responsible for Nova Scotia's Emergency Measures Organization said in this House of Assembly on November 9th he wanted to reassure this House that each Nova Scotian's safety and the safety of the communities in which they live is of the utmost importance. And whereas the Minister also said on November 9th that the safety and security of all citizens of Nova Scotia is of primary importance, and whereas the Minister also promised to get back to me about the lack of hazardous material emergency response team on the South Shore, but as of today, no information has come forth. Therefore, be it resolved that if the Minister sincerely believes his own words, he will immediately address the lack of a hazmat team on the South Shore and begin the implementation process of proper resources so residents in areas like Shelburne County will not feel threatened when tragic incidents such as the one in late June take place. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. I will now recognize the honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Digby powerlifter Paul Gidney placed third in the Master 1 category in the 93-kilogram weight class at the Canadians in Charlottetown last April, and whereas this placement has earned Paul a spot to compete in England this month in the Commonwealth Powerlifting Championships. And whereas Paul's hard work and dedication to powerlifting has currently ranked him second in his class. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Paul Gidney on his achievement and wish him the best of luck in the up-and-coming powerlift competitions. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Eddie Cummings Band, comprised of Eddie Cummings, Vern McDougall, Stephen Gillis, and Neil Campbell, all of Inverness County, released their debut CD entitled Perfect 10 at Mabu Cayley Days. And whereas the name of the CD refers to the release of 10 new original songs, which have been a collaborative effort by all band members, as well as a lyric in one of their songs. And whereas opportunities have been arising for the Eddie Cummings Band to open for well-known artists like Gordie Sampson and Matt Anderson. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate members of the Eddie Cummings Band on the release of their debut CD and wish them success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 2011 marks the 10th year of operation for the Stream Contact Centre in Glace Bay, and whereas Stream Glace Bay has garnered a reputation for first-class contact services to the major clients they represent, as well as being a quality corporate citizen in our community over the last decade. And whereas Glace Bay would be in peril without the 1,000+ direct jobs that Stream provides, in addition to the many small businesses it supports on Union and Commercial Streets. It is simply the foundation of our local economy. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly join me in wishing Stream a happy 10th anniversary, and we thank them for 10 years of commitment to the people of Glace Bay. And we will work together to protect the local business environment so that Stream is able to continue operations in our thankful community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Basil, a therapy dog with Therapeutic Paws of Canada, and his owner, George Young, have been welcome visitors to the Northside Community Guest Home for the past 8 months. And whereas Therapeutic Paws of Canada offers a volunteer-based therapy dog and cat visitation program for seniors facilities, nursing homes, daycare centres, and anywhere else there's need. Whereas Basil has developed an amazing relationship with the residents and offers unconditional love to improve the quality of their daily lives. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate George Young and Basil for their difference they're making in the lives of residents of Northside Community Guest Home and thank them for their dedication to the community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1975, Vernon Dion Lobster Plugs Limited sold his fishing boat to manufacture wooden lobster plugs. And in 1978, over 75 million lobster plugs were made and sold. And in 1981, the business expanded and began selling fishing supplies. And today, Vernon Dion Lobster Plugs currently employs over 40 people and ships products throughout the world. And whereas on November 23rd, 2011, the Yarmouth Area Chamber of Commerce held its annual Business Awards banquet, and whereas Vernon Dion Lobster Plugs Limited received the Business Person of the Year award, therefore be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Vernon Dion Lobster Plugs Limited on receiving the Yarmouth Area Chamber of Commerce Business Award for Business Person of the Year and thank him for his contributions to the fishing industry and to his community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas most Nova Scotians understand that a promise and a commitment are the same thing, and whereas Webster's English Dictionary defines a commitment as, quote, an agreement or pledge to do something in the future, end quote, and a promise as a, quote, declaration that one will do or refrain from doing something specified. And whereas the Oxford English Dictionary defines a commitment as a engagement or obligation that restricts freedom of action, and a promise as a declaration or assurance that one will do something or that a particular thing will happen. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this legislature urge the Premier to brush up on his synonyms and apologize to Nova Scotians for playing with words instead of doing what he said he was going to do. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas RBC Play Hockey is a wide-ranging, multi-year commitment to grow the game of hockey from the grassroots level in communities across North America. Whereas Straight Richmond Minor Hockey Association volunteer and RBC employee Joan Burke submitted an application to RBC Play Hockey, indicating that would try to keep costs low for hockey so more people could participate, along with initiatives to impact boys and girls hockey, goaltender training, as well as fostering involvement from the Aboriginal community. Whereas the Straight Richmond Minor Hockey Association was awarded a $25,000 grant as part of the 2011 RBC Play Hockey Grant Program, following a review of applications from a panel of hockey experts. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Straight Richmond Minor Hockey Association on receiving a $25,000 RBC Play Hockey grant and thank RBC Regional Vice President for Cape Breton and Eastern Nova Scotia, Steve Wadden, along with Port Hawkesbury RBC Branch Manager Peter Clough for their continued support of youth hockey programs. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 10-year-old Dane Peterson is a student at Bulladree Elementary School who every year donates his birthday money to a charity. And whereas this Christmas, the generosity of this young man will touch the hearts of not only needy families, but everyone in the small rural communities of Bullery. And whereas Dean, son of Andrew and Charlene Peterson, presented his 2011 birthday money, as well as 5 bags of groceries to the Bullery Food Bank. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognise and thank Dean for his heartfelt contribution to his community and wish he and his family the best this holiday season. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas residents of Ilmadam and Louisdale gathered this summer to celebrate the retirement of longtime St. Anne Community and Nursing Care Centre Administrator Eric Burke. Whereas prior to arriving at St. Anne's, Eric Burke was a regional nurse educator for Health Canada, Director of Nursing at hospitals in Alberta and the Northwest Territories, along with serving with the Department of Justice, Northwest Territories, and the Office of the Coroner. Whereas while he initially planned to be the administrator of St. Anne's for 5 years, Eric Burke left after 14 years with the facility, where he oversaw national accreditation as well as helping the board plot a direction for St. Anne's for years to come. Therefore, be it resolved, members of the House of Assembly thank Eric Burke for his 14 years as administrator of St. Anne Community and Nursing Care Centre and wish him well in his retirement. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to just draw the members' attention to the East Gallery. There are 2 friends of mine who are sitting up in the corner, Gary Randall and Donna Tidd from Kentville, who have strong connections to Digby as well. They're certainly active in my community and in other parts of Nova Scotia. And welcome to the House. I hope you'll give them your warm welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoyed today's proceedings. I will now recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Christian Major of Donkin has received recognition for her hard work in junior high, and whereas Christian was the winner of the Paul Gardner Memorial Award for exceptional school spirit over the 3 past years, and whereas Kristen recently completed grade 9 at the Donkin Gallery Complex in Donkin, Cape Breton, therefore be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Kristen Major on her outstanding accomplishments and wish her continued success in her high school years. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Monsieur le Président, par la présente, j'avise que je proposerai à une date ultérieure l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que Celebrating Communities Conference and Awards a eu lieu à Yarmouth les 28-30 septembre, et attendu que cette année on a voulu souligner le développement communautaire, la création d'emplois et des initiatives innovatrices dans les communautés acadiennes de Clare, Yarmouth et Argyll, et attendu que Como Seafood est reconnu dans la région comme étant un moteur économique de première importance dans le sud-ouest de la Nouvelle-Écosse et se mériter les honneurs pour sa contribution à long terme au développement économique de la région, qu'il soit résolu que tous les députés à cette Assemblée reconnaissent la contribution de Como Seafood au développement économique de Clare et de la province et félicite les propriétaires et leurs employés. Et Monsieur le Président, je propose l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2011 Celebrating Communities Conference and Awards was held in Yarmouth from September 28th to September 30th, and whereas this year's event focused on community development, job creation, and innovation in the Acadian communities of Clare, Argyll, and Yarmouth, and whereas a Lifetime Achievement Award was presented to recognize their long-term contribution to the economies of the communities in southwestern Nova Scotia, therefore be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Marcel Comeau,
president of Como Seafood Limited, and extend their appreciation for the leadership he has shown in our area. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dalbrae teacher John Gillis was awarded a Canadian Family Magazine National Great Teaching Award, and whereas the award recognizes excellence in Canadian teachers and includes a $1,500 cash prize that is available to the school in the form of bursaries for the next 3 years. And whereas Mr. Gillis has been active in organizing the annual career fair at the Academy and believes in assisting students to connect with employers to help them in gaining a work experience for their future careers. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate John Gillis on receiving the National Great Teaching Award and commend his efforts in preparing our youth for their future in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Peter McIntosh has been principal of North River Elementary School in Colchester North for 11 years, and whereas previously held teaching positions in Truro and Enfield, and then principal positions in 3 Colchester North schools, Masstown, Great Village, and DeBert, and whereas McIntosh retired in June 2010 with 34 years as a dedicated educator and administrator, therefore be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly express our thanks to Peter for his 34 years of dedication to the education of our students and wish him a healthy and happy retirement. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Sydney Mines Cape Breton Fossil Centre has completed another successful year and has seen an increase in visitors over the last year, including more visits from local schools. And whereas under the direction of curator Dr. Stuart Critchley, the centre now has fossils from around the world and provided 12 field trips to the actual fossil site. And whereas Dr. Critchley and support staff have provided tourists to Cape Breton, Canada's #1 island, with a unique tourist experience. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House join me in congratulating the Fossil Centre and staff on another stellar year and wish them continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas David Ehrenberg of Adcor Marketing Limited, along with his wife Elizabeth, own 5 restaurants which employ 140 staff members, and David Ehrenberg is a past recipient of the RRFB Annual Mobius Environmental Award in the category of Individual Excellence in Waste Management and Initiatives in Recycling, an award which recognizes the achievements of innovative Nova Scotians who have helped make our province a leader in waste reduction. And whereas on November 23, 2011, the Yarmouth Area Chamber of Commerce held its annual Business Awards banquet, and whereas David Ehrenberg of Adcor Marketing Limited received the Environmental Service Award, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate David Ehrenberg of Adcor Marketing Limited on receiving the Yarmouth Area Chamber of Commerce Business Award for Environmental Service and thank him for his contributions to preserving our community's environment. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Good member. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. We have now reached the time of oral questions put by members to ministers. It is 12:55. It will end at 1:55. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 3rd, I asked the Premier to reconsider first contract arbitration. When I said that Michelin warned the Premier that the introduction of the FAC in Nova Scotia would affect future investment in the province, the Premier laughed it off and said no such thing was ever said. Mr. Speaker, we now know that that's not true. Mr. Speaker, the President of Michelin Canada clearly stated that the introduction of first contract arbitration would affect future investment in Nova Scotia. When asked if this position was made clear to the Premier, the President of Michelin clearly said yes. My question to the Premier, will the Premier apologize to this House and all Nova Scotians for misleading them on Michelin's view of first contract arbitration?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to apologize, and in fact, I stand by what I said at the time, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite would know, that Mr. LeBlanc, who came in last night, I think I have a good relationship with them. I have a good relationship with George Sutherland. Mr. LeBlanc did not meet with me. I met, in fact, with George Sutherland, as Mr. LeBlanc pointed out, that those meetings and the things that they come to convey to us, of course, are done to ensure that we are fully aware of the positions that Michelin take with respect to various factors in investment, but also in other matters that they have that are of concern to them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. LeBlanc made it very clear that when the Premier went down to visit the Michelin headquarters of the United States, he did not bring up first contract arbitration. Mr. LeBlanc also made it very clear that when Michelin heard tell that first contract arbitration was being introduced in this province, that they told our Premier that it would affect future investment in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Michelin employs 3,500 Nova Scotians in three plants. These plants compete with other Michelin plants in the United States and North America and in Mexico for future investment. Last night, we heard from the President of Michelin say that the introduction of first contract arbitration would hurt Michelin Canada's opportunity for future investment, making Nova Scotia, and I quote, harder sell, end of quote, for future investment. On November 3rd, the Premier said, and I quote, that's simply not true, end of quote. We knew that he broke his promises about taxes, balanced budgets, ER closures, but we now know that he misrepresents the views of one of Nova Scotia's largest employers. So my question to the Premier, why did the Premier misrepresent the views of Michelin in this House?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I did no such thing. Mr. LeBlanc was here last night at the Law Amendments Committee. He made his view clear for everyone to hear. We encourage people who have views to share them, to come to the Law Amendments Committee. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, Michelin's been a good corporate citizen in this province. We've worked with them. They've been here for many, many years, and we, of course, will continue to do that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Michelin has been a good corporate citizen in this province, and at the very least, the Premier of this province should respect them enough not to misrepresent their views in public, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier tells us first contract arbitration will not affect business investment. Michelin says something different, Mr. Speaker. The Premier said it's not payback for unions. Unions say something different, Mr. Speaker. Premier says it will improve labor relations, Mr. Speaker. Business after business has said that is not true, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has also told us that Michelin had no complaints about first contract arbitration, blaming the press for misrepresenting the facts, Mr. Speaker. But we now know that it was the Premier who misled Nova Scotians about Michelin's comments. So my question to the Premier, why would any global employer come to a province where the Premier publicly misrepresents their company leaders' views?
The Honourable Leader of the Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know why they come to a province as Leader of the Opposition that publicly misrepresents what's being said, Mr. Speaker. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, Mr. Speaker, the issues associated with Michelin are ones that we, of course, work very hard on. We are, and I don't minimize at all the representations that are made by employers in this province. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that, and maybe this will enlighten the Leader of the Opposition, but companies, when they're making decisions with respect to investment, they they consider a lot of factors. They consider wage levels. They consider the access to labor power, to labor. They consider labor.
Order, please. Here we go. Order, please. I would like to hear the Premier, the Honourable the Premier.
So I was saying, Mr. Speaker, they consider the access to labor pool, they consider the access to skilled workers, they look at tax policy, they look at the question associated with currency exchange. There's a lot of things that they consider as factors in whether or not they're going to make a decision, one of which, of course, is labor stability.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's continue down this fact-finding exercise that we so sadly find ourselves engaging in today. On November 3rd, I asked the Premier about his meeting with Michelin and whether they told him that first contract arbitration would put a chill on the investment climate in this province and that they would consider holding back on future investment if he went forward with his plan. The Premier replied, and Hansard records, Mr. Speaker, no such thing was said. But yesterday, Dana LeBlanc, Michelin Canada's president, said at Law Amendments, laws like first contract arbitration do not help Michelin Canada present Nova Scotia as a better place to invest. And he repeated those comments to the media so that all Nova Scotians could hear them. And so I will ask the Premier, will he take this opportunity to tell Nova Scotians the truth about what Michelin told him in their meeting before he brought this law forward?
Honourable the Premier.
I will, Mr. Speaker. The answer that I gave the Leader of the Conservative Party at the time was the truth.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess that the people of Nova Scotia are going to have to decide between what Michelin says was said and what the Premier says was said, and I'll put my money with the Michelin Canada, who hired 3,000 Nova Scotians to have real jobs. That's where we're going to go, Mr. Speaker. On November 3rd, the Premier said in this House, of course we look forward to any future investments by Michelin in Nova Scotia. Then he went out and misrepresented their views about what they told him in their meeting with him, not once, but at least twice that they're telling us about. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, why put future jobs and investment at risk by misrepresenting the words of such an important employer in this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I didn't do that, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, I have always said that we have a great deal of respect for the major employers in our province, all of them. In fact, we have respect for all of our employers. We work with them hard to encourage the appropriate business environment for them, but we also understand the need for good legislation that builds stable, productive environments for both employers and employees, Mr. Speaker. That's what we intend to do.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, respect for employers starts by truthfully representing what they told them in meetings. Respect for employers means that listening to what they have to say, particularly when they employ so many thousands of Nova Scotians, when they express concerns about what the direction of this government is. However, Mr. Speaker, let me ask the Premier this. Last night, Rick Clark, who the Premier obviously does listen to, said that first contract arbitration is good for our economy and that employers like Michelin are, and I quote, fear-mongering about uninformed pronouncements of doom and gloom. And so I'll ask the Premier, who professes to have such respect for Michelin, who does he agree with? Rick Clark or Michelin? Is he right that Michelin is a fearmonger of doom and gloom, or is Michelin right that first contract arbitration is a bad idea?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I agree with is that I listen always carefully to the legitimate concerns of any employer in the province. I also listen to the legitimate concerns that are put forward by members of the labour movement. I listen to the legitimate concerns put forward by my constituents, Mr. Speaker, as all of those people would expect.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard employers around the province speak out. They share their concerns about the Manitoba model of first contract arbitration, Mr. Speaker. We know this government is intent on ramming through the Manitoba model, but we're not sure why. So my question to the Premier, why is the Manitoba model of first contract arbitration better than all the others?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, that's a question on the bill, but what I will say is that we obviously want to have a working mechanism in order to resolve unnecessary disputes, Mr. Speaker. So, as the member opposite would know, we introduced amendments last night to the committee for their consideration, which will provide some flexibility, address some of the concerns that were articulated, and I hope that the member opposite will have an opportunity to review those, and hopefully he'll agree that this is the best model for the province.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Manitoba model of FCA is not superior to other models, Mr. Speaker. That's why no other province in Canada has that part of FCA, Mr. Speaker. British Columbia, Newfoundland, Quebec, Ontario, federal governments have less aggressive forms of FCA. We've heard businesses say that if government is intent on ramming through first contract arbitration, please accept some of their amendments, Mr. Speaker. Businesses like Sobeys and Clearwater have offered amendments, Mr. Speaker, and we've listened. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, will the government accept the changes on first contract legislation that were presented to his government by the business community?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated just a little bit earlier, we have circulated for the consideration of the committee amendments that address some of the issues that we have heard over the committee hearings. Of course, those committee hearings are ongoing. There will be additional submissions made today. We, of course, keep an open mind, Mr. Speaker, and the member opposite says that they have some amendments that they want to bring forward to the committee, and of course, they'll be considered by the committee and reported back to the House, and we'll, the reason why we're here is, of course, is to debate those ideas, and when they come forward, we'll have an opportunity to debate them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
We could go a long way to improving the relationship between his government, Mr. Speaker, and the people who create the jobs in this province. First of all, he misrepresents what the president of Michelin says in a meeting in public, Mr. Speaker. The very least he could do is at least acknowledge he's listened to business leaders and accept some of their amendments to first contract arbitration before we continue to go down this road, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, documents used by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives list a host of first contract models. There's a fault model, Mr. Speaker, no fault model, the mediation support model, and of course the automatic or Manitoba model, Mr. Speaker. This report used by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and CUPE, I might add, Mr. Speaker, support the claims of Sobeys and Clearwater when they say there are other forms of FCA that would serve the government's purposes just as well. So my question to the Premier, given that the report used by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and CUPE offers support forms of FCA other than the Manitoba model, why does the government refuse to accept changes that were presented to his government?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we're an open, inclusive government. We like to bring in the opinions of all of the stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. That's why we set up the Labour Management Review Committee. That's why we have a study day. That is why, this is an opportunity for people to actually consult with government, which I know is something that at odds with the philosophy of former governments. But, Mr. Speaker, our view is that we look at all of those. Things, Mr. Speaker, and we'll consider the views of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I thought they appeared before the committee already, and Mr. Speaker, but I will go back to one thing, Mr. Speaker. I did not, and I would ask the Leader of the Opposition to stop misrepresenting this. I did not meet with the President of Michelin Canada. That's that, as I'm saying.
order, please. Order. Order, please. Order, please. Order. Order. The Honourable Premier has the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just making the point that I'm sure that he understands that that was not the case, and I think Mr. LeBlanc indicated that as well. He did not meet with me in relation to this matter. I was just making that point because I don't want him to inadvertently misrepresent the facts.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote the member from for Cole Harbour from May 28, 2008, as reported in the Cape Breton Post. Now, with power bills going up, they're rightfully worried about freezing in the dark next winter. These increases will make life less affordable for every family in the province, and these increases will affect jobs as Nova Scotia industries struggle to remain competitive. And that was about power rate increases, less than what we're going to be dealing with on January 1st. So, Mr. Speaker, with a combined double-digit power rate increase coming January 1st, and many other increases since he said that in 2008, how does the Premier feel about people freezing in the dark this winter because they won't be able to pay for their power bills? And how does he feel about jobs being impacted and industry struggling due to higher power rates?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, I think it's terrible, but the reality is because past governments refused to make the choices that needed to be made to get us off of fossil fuels, we end up having to deal with the escalating costs of fossil fuels. Mr. Speaker, we are making the right decisions to get us off of that roller coaster so that we can have fair, stable rates for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier mentioned the right decisions, and it's interesting how the right decisions change from when the NDP were in the election and when they became government a few months ago. I would like to quote a letter written on behalf of the Premier by Mr. Dan O'Connor, dated June 3rd, 2009, references the fact that we're in the election regarding the demand-side management fee. It says, quote, "It should be rather based on the notion that the utility will bear the costs for DSM-related investments in order to stabilize its long-term position in the market." And further, he says that the proposal, which of course was then by the Tory government to the URB, places the burden of DSM-related improvements too heavily on residential users. Yet we all know in the first session of this House, the NDP introduced legislation that added that tax to residential power bills. And I'll table that letter. So, Mr. Speaker, would the Premier like to explain why his position changed on who should pay for efficiency costs and why he put the burden on ratepayers instead of shareholders?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as he knows, this was a decision that was made by the Utility and Review Board, and I guess the question would be whether or not we would replace the opinion of the government with the considered opinion of the Utility and Review Board that has received all the evidence of the experts. And what's more, Mr. Speaker, is the question of whether or not one of the best ways to actually cut the power bills of consumers is by ensuring that there is an energy efficiency program. So I guess the question for the member opposite is that is he suggesting either that the general taxpayers of Nova Scotia should support energy efficiency, or is he suggesting that there should be no energy efficiency program?
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Premier is aware that we believe that shareholders of Nova Scotia Power should pick up those costs, just like the NDP believed during the election, not ratepayers like they thought afterwards. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's answer is amusing because the Utility and Review Board hadn't made that decision. In fact, the former Minister of Energy had an announcement with the report downstairs, and they passed the legislation that then allowed the URB to look at that rate. The decision was made by this Premier to put a new tax on the electrical bill of every single Nova Scotian. Mr. Speaker, The Premier, when he was in opposition, also said people are looking down the road to a winter and they know electricity bills are going to take a big bite out of their family budgets. The fact is, the Premier now uses excuses that are all about things that will happen in the future and has no actions for today. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has to stand up for Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, now that Nova Scotian ratepayers are facing even higher increases, why does the Premier sit by and say it's always up to the Utility and Review Board when that was not a good enough answer for him when he was in opposition?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't. And in fact, it is this government that took the 8% tax increase that the Conservative government put on home energy. That's why we took it off, Mr. Speaker, was because we understand the responsibility of government not to tax a necessity of life, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier of Manitoba, the Premier of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia needs investment to create jobs. Nova Scotia needs investment to take advantage of the shipyard contract, or the government will blow it. We need investment for New Page, or the government will blow it. For Bowater, before they blow it. For Michelin, before they blow it. My question to the Premier, will he finally listen to all of those who are telling him that first contract arbitration will, and I quote, make it difficult to sell Nova Scotia as a place to invest, or continue down his ruinous path?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just point out to the member opposite, Manitoba has one of the most robust economies in our province under the leadership of Premier Selinger, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotia has a very good reputation in the international community. Everywhere I've gone, talked to companies who are looking to invest, they cite Nova Scotia as one of those who are always on their list when they're considering investment, and that will continue to be the case, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, there is only one way to create jobs, particularly jobs in rural Nova Scotia, and that is to attract investment that leads to those jobs. It's as simple as that. There's only one way to give hope to all of those that are going to graduate from school and hope that there's a job there for them when they do. There's only one solution to the social problems we have, to the funding for health and education, and that is to attract investment and create jobs and build the wealth that we need to fund those programs that all Nova Scotians hold dear. It is as simple as that, Mr. Speaker, and yet we have a Premier that does not get it. And so I will ask him again, will he please finally listen to the unanimous views of those who make investments and create jobs in our province and stop his current plan on first contract arbitration before any real damage is done?
Honourable the Premier.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we listen daily to those people who are looking to make investments in Nova Scotia. They continue, of course, to tell us that this is a great jurisdiction in which to do business.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that we have a Premier that has no background in creating jobs or attracting investment, and now we have a government that has no background in creating jobs and attracting investment. In fact, they are losing jobs monthly, as Statistics Canada tells us. At least we would hope they would listen to those that do. But instead, he insists on listening to backroom advisors like Rick Clark, his right-hand man on the economy, who again have no idea how to create a job or make investments in our province. So I will ask the Premier this: will he at least concede that he needs to listen to someone else besides Rick Clark, someone that does know about creating jobs and creating investment, listen to what they have to say, and then take the right action, which is to stop this bad bill, first contract arbitration, before we really do damage in this province, before he does?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd invite him to have a look at the list of people who are included in the Premier's Council on the Economy, and then tell me that those people don't know about creating investment in this province, Mr. Speaker. That's simply not true. Mr. Speaker, the plans the plans for government, whether it's in jobs here or the workforce strategy, all those came about as a result of the hard work of people who every day are making investments in this province, who are creating jobs. Unlike the members opposite, Mr. Speaker, who had the worst economic development results in the country for 20 years.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier stood in this House and said he has kept every single commitment that they made during the last election. We'll certainly put that to the test, Mr. Speaker. Apart from saying that they wouldn't raise taxes and then hiking the HST, this government committed in their brochure during the election to creating 2,200 new jobs per year. Mr. Speaker, between October 2009 and October 2011, there was a net job loss in this province of 5,200 jobs. In the last year alone, rural Nova Scotia has lost 6,600 jobs, Mr. Speaker. So my question, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism explain to this House how losing thousands of jobs is keeping his commitment to create 2,200 jobs per year?
We're all ready now? The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to stand in my place and say that since June of 2009 and June of 2011 is that we've created and supported 3,000 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's 3,000 jobs. And Mr. Speaker, I stand here in my place and I've said repeatedly is that one job loss in the province of Nova Scotia is sad. However, I am, and as my colleagues are very aware, times have changed in the world. Is that there are things that are simply out of the control of Nova Scotians. We have a strategy for the first time, Mr. Speaker, and I mean this sincerely, for the first time, Mr. Speaker, in at least 20 years, we have a vision to move this province forward in every region of the province of Nova Scotia. Jobs here.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Premier suggested that I wouldn't come to him with that question. And the reason why I wouldn't come to him with that question is because I would think that the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism should be able to answer the questions on economy and job losses. But they will come to the Premier, Mr. Speaker.
Calculate unemployment.
As the Minister, as we learned yesterday, it is not only 6,600 jobs lost which is causing this crisis in rural Nova Scotia. Close to 10,000 people in the past year have exited the workforce outside of Halifax. 9,800 people that are no longer looking for work, they've simply given up. Mr. Speaker, not only did this Minister fail to keep his commitment to create 2,200 jobs per year, but almost 10,000 left the workforce entirely to get out here because they don't have jobs in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism admit to Nova Scotians that by every measure possible, he has failed to keep his campaign commitment to create 2,200 jobs per year in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this minister has committed to do is to create as many jobs in the province of Nova Scotia as possible. And Mr. Speaker, we have a strategy. It's a good strategy. We are going to stay the course because we believe in that strategy. And it is called Jobs Here.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2,200 jobs per year is what the NDP promised. 2,200 jobs, Mr. Speaker, and we're nowhere near that. What did Nova Scotians get instead, Mr. Speaker? A plan with no job targets. And as many jobs as possible is not a target where there's hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars involved. the IEF2, which will be controlled by Cabinet, not business experts, and numbers that can't be celebrated by this minister, the Minister of Finance, or any of the government, no matter which one you choose. 5,200 net jobs lost between October 2009 and 2011. 6,600 jobs lost in rural Nova Scotia. 9,800 people in rural Nova Scotia exiting the workforce. And finally, the lowest economic growth of any province in this country, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism admit that the Premier misled the House yesterday when he said the NDP have kept every single election commitment that they made in the last election?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier said in response to my question that, quote, this government has kept every single commitment made during the last election, end of quote. He repeated the statement not once, not twice, but 3 times, Mr. Speaker. And as I've quoted before, in the words of this Premier, that's simply not true. One example is during the CBC TV Leaders Debate, where the Premier said, we are not going to raise taxes, and I will table that, Mr. Speaker. Less than a year into the government's mandate, he raised the HST by 2%. Now, anyone would call that a commitment, Mr. Speaker. Today, I asked the Premier, through you, to define exactly what he meant by commitments and just how that differs from a commitment like the one he made in the Leaders' Debate.
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the commitments were made in our platform document. I'm sure the member has an opportunity to have a look at it and had a chance maybe to check off each one of the commitments that have been kept.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
So I guess, Mr. Speaker, that means Nova Scotians need to get it in writing. Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, if asked questions about promises, the Premier plays a silly game with Nova Scotians and pretends there's a difference between promise and commitment. He's trying to take Nova Scotians for fools, which they are not. If the Premier still claims he has kept all of his commitments, Mr. Speaker, and he is careful to use only that word, will he concede that he has broken many of his promises, pledges, agreements, or other similar expressions where he told Nova Scotians to accept on faith what he had to say?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, many of the people in Nova Scotia, myself included, were forced to accept what was, egregious misrepresentation of the financial situation of the province by the previous government, Mr. Speaker. They told us the budget was balanced. They told us that there wouldn't be any deficits, Mr. Speaker, and yet the independent assessment proved that the previous government had put us on track for a $1.6 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker. And it is unfortunate that a responsible government has to undertake the measures that are required to bring the province back to balance, Mr. Speaker. Surely no one likes to raise taxes, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is because of the awful financial situation that they left us in, we had very little choice in the matter, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Wow, I've seen a lot of spinning in this House, but definitely that's one of the worst ones I've ever seen. Don't forget, Mr. Speaker, a message from the Minister. The public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2009 reported a surplus of $19.7 million, Mr. Speaker. And that same report that he's quoting from also said, it's signed by Graham Steele. Oh, sorry. The Minister of Finance. I retract that, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, as much as he continues to say that, that this wasn't a balanced budget. Oh, time and time again, organizations came and said that it was. So, you know, we can debate that one all day here in the legislature. Mr. Speaker, if the Premier can make such outrageously inaccurate statements before this House, how can any Nova Scotian trust him to manage their future, Mr. Speaker? He broke commitments not to raise taxes, to keep ERs open 24/7, to balance the budget in the first year, and to keep politics out of politics, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, my question to this Premier is, will he retract his statement, knowing full well that Nova Scotians will see his outrageous, deliberately inaccurate statements as unacceptable behavior for a Premier?
I'm just going to remind members that it's improper to refer to another member by their name in any way during any proceedings in the House. And that includes notices of motion while reading documents such as newspapers, just to remind all members. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'd remind the member opposite that in the first full year of this government, not only did we balance the budget, we ran a surplus, we paid every single capital expense out of revenue, and, Mr. Speaker, we paid down debt. That's what we did, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on May 20th, 2009, on the front page of the Chronicle Herald, the Premier is quoted as stating, "We're not going to raise taxes." Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table that article as well. So that's not in the pamphlet, it's in the Herald. This was said in response to a question at the Leaders' Debate where he was asked under what circumstances an NDP government would raise taxes. Mr. Speaker, his answer was definitive. It says, quote, "We're not going to raise taxes." My question to the Premier is, does the Premier deny that he made that promise in the May 2009 campaign?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we did do is we took the tax off of home energy. We took the tax off of several necessities of life, Mr. Speaker. We amended the income tax provision so that we ensured that seniors no longer pay income tax if they're receiving the GIS, Mr. Speaker. Those are the kinds of tax measures that we undertook, Mr. Speaker. It is, in fact, the case that the leader of the opposition, now leader of the opposition, couldn't put forward a costed platform. In fact, I think they said his dog ate the page that had the costing on it. Wasn't it, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we made the commitments that we made in our platform, and we're keeping it.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my question today wasn't about all the other things that the government has deluded themselves with, but it's the fact that they have raised the HST in this province. That's the question. That's the action that we're looking for. That's what we've seen, and that's what Nova Scotians are feeling every day. So, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we know that the promise or commitment was made, and at the same time in the 2010-11 provincial budget, there was a tax hike, and I'll be happy to table as well the budget bulletin for that year. It shows a 2 percentage point increase in the HST. So, Mr. Speaker, a tax hike is a tax hike. And that definitely was exactly what the Premier promised not to do. My question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is does the Premier deny that he raised the provincial portion of the HST by 2 percentage points in the 2010 budget?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what we did was undertook the necessary measures to make sure that the provinces gets back to balance, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, you know, because of really what can only be thought of as misrepresentations as to the financial health of the province. What we found when we came to office, as was accurately portrayed in the Deloitte report, is a substantial structural deficit. So, Mr. Speaker, there are choices, of course, and I've never heard the Leader of the Opposition or any opposition member saying that what they would have liked to see is much deeper cuts to the Department of Health, much deeper cuts to education, Mr. Speaker, higher debt, loaded onto the backs of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So which is it? Which is it, Mr. Speaker?
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the Premier of this province says that he didn't know during the election what the state of the provincial budget was all about, what our finances look like. It's interesting to note that because during that election and during the very same debate, the leader of the Liberal Party said we couldn't say because we knew it was bad. We didn't promise not to raise taxes. That was cheap. We knew that, and you could have asked your own Minister of Finance, pardon me, the Premier should have asked his own Minister of Finance, who at the time was the critic, and that critic knew full well that the province's budget was, finances were in trouble. So it was a very inappropriate and opportunistic response to say that you would never raise taxes. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is why didn't you consult with your finance critic at the time to get the true story?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I will point out to the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, is that not just what I said, but of course, when you looked at the economic panel,
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What you looked at, what the economic panel said, is that not only could I not have known, but there were economists who did not predict the results because we were not privy to the same information that the previous government was privy to, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Colin MacDonald, the president of Clearwater Fine Foods, he spoke to the Law Amendments Committee, and during the questioning at Law Amendments Committee, when asked about the government's anti-business labour legislation, Mr. MacDonald warned that first contract arbitration would do, and I quote, serious damage to Nova Scotia's reputation as a place to work and do business, end quote. Clearly, the fisheries industry has some serious concerns about the government's extreme anti-business agenda. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, is for the Minister of Fisheries. Given the importance of companies like Clearwater and the overall importance of the fishery industry here in Nova Scotia, what steps did the Minister take to ensure that the fisheries industry was invited to take part in a fair and open consultation on this new labour legislation?
Honourable the Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the question. I'm going to divert this question to the Premier.
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we take the advice from all the sectors seriously, but what I can tell you is that I hear almost daily about the great reputation that Nova Scotia has and about the great way in which this government has brought forward things like the manufacturing and processing credits, things like, Mr. Speaker, the workforce strategy, things like the Jobs Here plan that clearly identifies what it is that businesses want in order to be able to invest in the province. We're very proud of those strategies, Mr. Speaker, and they can be assured that we will continue with them.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Well, when you've seen the response from the minister when he was looking to find out who would he consult with, it's interesting they're consulting now, but they didn't have time to do that when they were putting this legislation forward. Mr. Speaker, Mr. MacDonald told the committee that a higher HST, higher power rates, and demographic issues were already providing businesses like his with enough challenges. Simply put, and I quote, "We do not need to invent more reasons why companies shouldn't come here to Nova Scotia," end quote. Mr. MacDonald continued to say, and I quote, "We are being actively pursued by other jurisdictions where we do business to locate some of our activities there. They provide us with guaranteed funding, guarantees of labour fees, and additional incentives such as tax benefits." Now, I mention this because I know other companies looking to come in Nova Scotia and expand in Nova Scotia are being offered the same thing. Mr. McDonald's comments, Mr. Speaker, are proof. Other jurisdictions are looking to take advantage of Nova Scotia's anti-business climate. Now, my question for the Minister of Fisheries, and hopefully he can speak on an industry he's been part of all of his life, does he understand the risk his government extreme labour agenda opposes to the fisheries industry here in Nova Scotia? When will he stand up to those in the fisheries industry by going to the cabinet table and telling the Premier and the Minister of Labour that it's time the government end its crusade against business and look out for the best interests of the fishery here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, I refer this question to the Minister of Labour.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure which business associations the fishers belong to, but certainly there were the Canadian manufacturers and exporters were involved in the consultation, and I just want to remind people that certainly we are fully convinced, based on experience across Canada, the 85% of workers, Canadian workers, are already covered under first contract, that this proposed legislation is something that's going to help stabilize the economy. It is only meant, and everyone recognizes that for the very few circumstances when the two parties cannot sit down around a negotiating table and reach a satisfactory conclusion. And we have provided the checks and balances to protect both the workers and the businesses, and this should be of reassurance to business in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's obvious that the minister just doesn't get it.
Which one? Which minister?
You know, Mr. Speaker, one of the most important jobs as minister is to make sure that the fisheries industry here in Nova Scotia is represented and adequately consulted on new legislation that will affect their business. And Mr. Speaker, he's failed. The minister refuses to stand up, as we've seen twice already, for the industry at the cabinet table, and instead answers to the beck and call of the Premier and the Minister of Labour, continuing to support legislation that the President of Clearwater called, and I quote, draconian, end of quote. My question for the Minister of Fisheries, and hopefully this time he'll try and answer, whose side is the Minister of Fisheries on? Is he standing with the fisheries industry and the many people employed in it, or is he like the rest of the cabinet and standing with the NDP's big Labour friends?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, I respect the comments. Mr. Cullen, I know him very well. I also know the industry. And I can also tell you that this minister, this government, is standing up for the inshore fisheries and the fisheries in Nova Scotia. I can take you back to roughly 100 years ago when our famous Blue Nose schooner was the leader in all competition in the international fishing industry. We were a winner then, we are a winner now, and we'll continue to represent the fishing industry, which is the strongest in Canada, in Atlantic Canada. Thank you very much for that question.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, today Boston will light up their Christmas tree in Nova Scotia, and it's an important gift that recognizes not only the thanks for the Halifax explosion, but also is supposed to celebrate the strength and importance of our Christmas tree export market. Unfortunately, the NDP doesn't seem to understand the industry's importance, because in June, the Department of Natural Resources announced it had terminated 2 tree specialist positions. Mr. Speaker, this has left a huge service gap in the industry, and the Christmas Tree Council and its associations have been working to try and address this shortfall and are still struggling. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the minister cut these 2 positions?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess we've moved into December now, and it is the season of Christmas. I want to thank the honourable member for his Christmas card that he sent me just very recently. So very nice and good to support a local project in his own constituency. The Boston Christmas tree was, as you mentioned, was just recently harvested this year in Yarmouth County. I had the honour of being with the member from Argyll while we cut that tree, and I think the Deputy Premier is just this very day attending, and that tree is being erected in Boston. Our Christmas tree industry is very important to the economy of Nova Scotia. I think about 1.5 million trees are cut on an annual basis and exported really as far away as Dubai in the Middle East. And we have changed our focus in the department on how we support the industry, but we recognize it as a very important industry, and we'll continue to work with the industry and the growers and try to expand our industry in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not really sure what to say about that answer. I wanted to know why he cut the 2 positions, and Mr. Speaker, it's worth noting the 2 positions are still noted on his department's, on the minister's website as being active when he's fired those 2 people. So, Mr. Speaker, furthermore, the minister just talked about, or I think he talked about, how important he thinks the Christmas tree industry is, and yet he didn't even consult with the council before the positions were eliminated. They were shocked, and I'm sure the minister has seen their statements on the issue, and they feel like they were sideswiped. You know, the minister cut the 2 positions and didn't even tell the Christmas Tree Association in advance. So why he would think that they would believe that he thinks the Christmas tree industry is important is beyond me. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the department not provide any indication to the Christmas Tree Council and the employees that the NDP caused to be fired that these cuts were happening?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those 2 individuals that were our Christmas tree specialists are still employed by the Department of Natural Resources. They have moved to take on extra responsibilities. They still have expertise in Christmas trees, but they're looking after woodlot extension and other duties within the department. And also other outreach people within the department are also now providing education and outreach on Christmas trees. So really, we've gained more people to help advise the industry. And we also have put a strong emphasis on research and working with our research partners at the Agricultural College in Truro. And that's another way to try to get mainly on needle retention to allow our balsam fir, known around the world as one of the best trees for Christmas trees in the world. And we're continuing to market and put an emphasis on good quality research.
Good Minister. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the minister knows it's about the 2 positions. He knows that the outreach people were helping the Christmas industry before that. Those aren't new. That isn't new support. He has eliminated support, and he did it without consulting the industry. Those are the facts. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, there are roughly 1,200 families involved in the cultivation of Christmas trees in this province. It's an industry that generates $30 million in business, employs 400 full-time workers, and creates 2,000 seasonal jobs. And maybe the minister didn't know that. But the link to the 2 Christmas tree specialists are still on his website today, even though he eliminated the positions in June. So it's obviously not that important to him. Mr. Speaker, the NDP likes to talk about investments and retaining jobs, but here are 2 that they eliminated directly. Mr. Speaker, will the minister agree to restore those 2 specialist positions to help ensure 2 dedicated individuals for the Christmas tree industry?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those 2 specialists are still employed within the department in a different role. Additional people are now providing service as well to our Christmas tree growers. We also have a strong emphasis on the smart Christmas tree balsam project, as I mentioned, at the research station at Bible Hill. And we are also funding now a new coordinator for the industry, and again working very closely with the Christmas Tree Council, and they are very much on side with that project. And I would hope the honourable member would look at buying a real Christmas tree this year, as I would encourage all members in our House to support our local industry. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, residents in Richmond County and the Strait area are looking for answers after 5 separate power outages took place yesterday. Schools were cancelled, meals were ruined, and everyone was left frustrated. Power outages also took place earlier in the week, all at a time when the weather was favourable for this time of the year. And yet this week, residents in Richmond County and all Nova Scotians learned that they are expected to pay an additional 6.1% on their power bills as of January 1st, 2012. So my question is, will the Premier explain to the residents of Richmond County why they should pay an additional 6.1% to Nova Scotia Power in the face of such poor service?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would hope on behalf of his constituents he's raised these issues directly with Nova Scotia Power, and they of course have a maintenance facility, and they have a maintenance budget which they use to try and strengthen the grid. But that's the only suggestion that I can make to the member. What I can say is that he should tell his constituents that the government is working hard to get off the roller coaster of unpredictable rate increases by reducing our reliance on fossil fuel and ensuring that we have stable, long-term energy rates that will be good both for residents and for businesses.
Honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, power is an essential service and a basic necessity. While Nova Scotians understand power outages may occur in storms, it's hard to justify the repeated power outages that took place yesterday and earlier this week in Richmond County. Residents are rightfully asking, if repeated outages are taking place in mild weather, what are they to expect once winter fully sets in? The response from this NDP government is to hide behind the Utility and Review Board, while Nova Scotians are asked to pay an additional 6.1% for such poor, unreliable service. So my question again to the Premier is, when will the government demand that Nova Scotia Power make upgrades and investments to their infrastructure in order to maintain a secure power system for all Nova Scotians?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a private company. It's not a department of government. Mr. Speaker, I would yesterday the power was out in Cole Harbour, Mr. Speaker. When that happens, of course, I want to know the reasons why, and if it's going to continue to be a systemic thing, I make representations to the company and ask them to ensure that the appropriate upgrades are made. I would recommend that to the member opposite.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, this is the government that continues to allow Nova Scotia Power to have a monopoly in this province. In doing so, they know it's a basic necessity for Nova Scotians. They've had 2 years now, 2 long years, to break the monopoly. Had they wanted to, they've chose not to do so. When we see kids being sent home because of power outages in mild weather, this government should be paying attention and should take notice, not telling the people of Richmond County, call Nova Scotia Power. Mr. Speaker, if Nova Scotians are to continue to see rate increases, this government has a responsibility to demand to the Utility and Review Board that Nova Scotia Power upgrade its infrastructure and make the necessary investments. So again, my question to the Premier, in light of 5 power outages in one day, school cancellations, and the misery that caused yesterday, will the Premier finally demand to the Utility and Review Board that Nova Scotia Power make the necessary investments to their infrastructure?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not really sure where the member opposite was going with that question. You know, the reality is that in most provinces, the utilities are monopolies. In this province, of course, there's a slight difference because we have municipal utilities that do provide service to some to some of the municipalities. Mr. Speaker, he would know that the way that the rate base is decided is by investments that go into the rate base. So what he's saying is to increase, I assume what he's saying is either increase the investment in the grid, which I'm sure Nova Scotia Power would be happy to do because that's how they make their case for higher rates, Mr. Speaker. So, and I don't think that's really what the member wants is higher rates, although I do note that he voted against taking the HST off of home electricity.
You did. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, during the election campaign, the NDP promised to create 2,200 new jobs per year through the manufacturer's tax credit. After 2.5 years, the NDP, there should be 5,500 new jobs somewhere, anywhere. But Statistics Canada clearly show that there are 5,300 fewer full-time jobs in Nova Scotia from October 2009 to October 2011. Not the extra 5,500 this government promised. Mr. Speaker, whenever the Premier gets asked about promises...
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to Minister has expired. I will now try to get the Deputy Government House Leader in his place. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please call public bills for second reading. Please call Bill number 122, the Environment Act.
Public bills for second reading, number 122, the Environment Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly happy to say a few words about the Bill 122, Amendments to the Environment Act. The Environment Act is the foundation of our work at Nova Scotia Environment. It guides how we protect the environment and human health and how we respond when our environment is threatened. Mr. Speaker, the Environment Act requires that the legislation be reviewed every 5 years. The Act was reviewed in 2000 and the broad public and stakeholders consultation was conducted. Changes was tabled in 2006. Mr. Speaker, this year we completed another legislative review of the Environmental Act. An advisory committee made up of municipal, industry, and environment organization members provided feedback on our work. Our department also conducted stakeholders and public consultation, and I want to thank the members of the advisory committee for their hard work and their dedication to protecting the environment. I also want to thank our stakeholders and members of the public who provided comments. We received 60 submissions during our consultations, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians told us that the Act certainly is working well. However, we are taking this opportunity to make the environment even stronger. Mr. Speaker, the work of the advisory committee and the comments that we received are certainly reflected in this bill. This legislation will enhance our ability to protect the environment and human health. The most substantial change will allow us certainly to build more flexibility in how we protect the environment, Mr. Speaker. Currently, the Act requires an approval process for all activities, regardless of their potential impact on the environment. This legislation will allow us to make changes to create and enforce clear rules for low-risk activities. Mr. Speaker, these changes will give our staff more time in the field during their important work dealing with issues that affect our environment. The changes to the definition of adverse effects will focus staff attentions where certainly the authority is on the Act, rather than answering complaints that don't impact the environment. It will put our people and resources where they are needed the most, Mr. Speaker. We're also changing the time frame of the legislation review to every 10 years from every 5 years. And we've heard that the Environment Act is working well for Nova Scotians, so we think this time frame is reasonable. Other jurisdictions don't even have a legislature review, and their environmental legislation So Nova Scotia is a leader in this area, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to take a moment to speak on something that is not in the legislation. During our consultation, we asked Nova Scotians what they think about the administrative penalties or monetary penalties imposed on a person or a company that breaks the law. Nova Scotians said that they want more discussions, more information before we even consider administrative penalties. They spoke and we listened, Madam Speaker, and that is why we are not moving forward with administrative penalties at this time. In the coming months, staff will be reviewing our process to see how we can best protect the environment and human health. I want to thank my colleagues in the House and all Nova Scotians for their interest, their comments, and their support. I certainly look forward to comments from the members opposite. I move Bill 122 for second reading. Thank you.
I now recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Try it again. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise on the amendments to the Environment Act. Let me start by saying that I'm pleased that the Minister chose not to include the administrative penalty section in these amendments of the Act. While there's clearly a need for an enforcement mechanism and a fine mechanism, I'm glad that the Minister has chosen to leave that method of doing it out of this Act at this time, because of course we know that the administrative penalties can be seen as a sort of conviction before being proven guilty on something, and there's got to be some sort of balance. So I would like to thank the Minister for doing that. You know, I guess from a personal perspective, I would almost rather see a completely new Environment Act written. This is, and I recognize that's something that takes time, and the government, and obviously the Minister is trying to address some short-term issues, but I think we've come to the point where the Environment Act is old and it's outdated, and we're always tweaking things and finding things that don't work. So I hope that at some point, given the realities of environmental concerns and environmental health concerns, that we will be moving towards having a completely rewritten Environment Act at some point in the future. Specific to the changes the Minister makes here, I'd like to comment on a few of them. Moving the review from 5 to 10 years is probably actually, from a practical point of view, makes sense, because by the time